Assalamu alaikum students. This is the second part of our topic Mesopotamian civilization. Clothing, dressing for men and women. The clothing style also depended on the status of an individual. The rich wore clothes made of expensive materials. Colorful and bright outfits were common among the wealthy people. Jewelry like necklace and earrings were common. They were set with precious stones, even brooches, hair ornaments, neck chains were used, and they were habitual to use a leather skin dresses. Next one is animals. Horse has been used as a domestic animal for the long time. Horse pulling carts, they became one of the most useful beasts in the entire civilization. Horse breeding emerged as one of the most profitable business of all time in this era. Onagers, the solution that the masses took out was to breed them with domesticated donkeys, which would result is somewhat a sturdy mule. The animals was very useful and a part of carrying load could also be ridden as and when required. Oxen. These were the simplest yet the strongest cart pullers in Mesopotamia. Initially, the drivers controlled these sturdy beasts by pulling ropes tied around their horns. However, with time, the invention of yoke made it easier on the part of these drivers. A couple of oxen were generally used to carry heavier weight, and sheep and goats were also important for the wool and hair respectively. Meat was also required for the elites, and the requirements were made by beef, sheep, poultry, and goats. Sumerians. Social, economic, and intellectual basis of Sumerians irrigated fields and produced three main crops barley, dates, and sesame seeds. They built canals, dikes, dams, and drainage system. They developed cuneiform writing. Abundance of food led to steady increase of population, farms, towns, cities. First city of the world developed a trade system with bartering, mainly barley, but also wool and cloth for stone, metals, timber, copper, pearls, and ivory. Individuals could only rent land from priests who controlled land on behalf of gods. Most of profit of trade went to the temple. Nearly every machine built since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution involves a single basic principle embodied in one of mankind's truly significant inventions. It's hard to imagine any mechanized system that would be possible without the wheel or the idea of a symmetrical component moving in a circular motion on an axis. It is interesting to note that wheels may have had industrial or manufacturing applications before they were used on vehicles. The next one were Hadians. Their leader, Sargon the Great Sargon, unified Lower Mesopotamia after conquering Sumerians, established capital at Ahad, spread Mesopotamian culture. Short-lived dynasty, as the Hadians were conquered by the invading barbarians. Next one is Babylonians. King Hamrabi's Babylon. Babylonians reunited Mesopotamia. The central location dominated trade and secured control. Yet again, Mesopotamia was not unified for long. Artisans and merchants could keep most profit and even formed guilds, associations, grains used as the medium of exchange. They create emergence of measurement of currency. Babylon was one of the developed city. These are the pictures of ancient Babylonian city. You can see how beautiful that was. What was Code of Hamrabi? To enforce his rule, Hamrabi collected all the laws of Babylon in a code that would apply everywhere in the land. Most extensive law code from the ancient world. It was very famous. Code of 282 laws inscribed on a stone pillar placed in the public hall for all to see. Hamrabi stone depicts Hamrabis as receiving his authority from god Shamash. Set of divinely inspired laws as well as associates laws. Punishments were designed to fit the crimes as people must be responsible for own actions. Hammurabi Code was an origin to the concept of eye for an eye. That is, if a son struck his father, the son's hand would be cut off. Consequences for crimes depended on rank in society. That is, they only fine for nobility. Punishments were more strict for poor, and for rich people there was a fine. These are some pictures of Code of Hammurabi. The next one is Assyrian 10th century BC. Assyrian emerged as dominant force in the north city of Ashur, become important trading and political center after Hammurabi's death. Babylon fell apart and kings of Ashur controlled more of surroundings area and come to dominate. Made conquered lands, pay taxes like food, animal, metals or timbers. Ruled by fear as kings were first to have a permanent army made up of professional soldiers. They established a permanent army. Made superior weapons of bronze and iron. Iron changed lifestyles in Mesopotamia, in weapons and in daily life. Replaced wooden wheels and applied to horse drawn carrots. Assyrian returned Mesopotamia and established the first true empire. However, states began to revolt and once again Assyrian empire collapsed by the late 17th century. By 539 BC, Mesopotamia, part of the vast Persian Empire. Persian Empire dominated for 800 years until Alexander the Great. Writing of Mesopotamian. Pictograms. There were pictograms. What was pictograms? Picture to show meaning, ideograms. Signs to represent words. They used small signs instead of words. Phonetics. Signs to represent sounds. Phonetics are the basis of most writing system. Greatest contribution of Mesopotamia to Western civilization was the invention of writing, allowed the transmission of knowledge, the codification of laws, records of facilitate trade, farming. He development of cuneiform. The Sumerian writing system during the early periods was constantly in flux. The original direction of writing was from top to bottom, but for reasons unknown, it changed to left to right very early, perhaps 3000 BC. This also affected the orientation of the signs by rotating all of them to 90 degree or clockwise. Another change in this early system involved the style of the signs. The early signs were more linear in that the strokes making up the signs were lines and curves. But starting after 3000 BC, these strokes started to evolve into wedges, thus changing the visual style of the signs from linear to cuneiform. The beginning of writing, farmers needed to keep records. The Sumerians were very good farmers. They raised animals such as goats and cows, or you can say livestock, because they needed to keep record of their livestock, food, and other things. Officials began using tokens. Tokens were used for trade. Tokens were made in clay tablets. Clay tokens came into different shape and sizes. These represented different objects. For example, a cone shape could have represented a bag of wheat. These tokens were placed inside clay balls that were sealed. If you were sending 5 goats to someone, then you would put 5 tokens in the clay ball. When the goat arrived, the person would open the clay ball and count the token to make sure the correct number of goats had arrived. The number of tokens began to be pressed on the outside of the clay balls. Many experts believe that this is how writing on clay tablets began. A system of writing develops. The earliest form of writing dates back to 3300 BC. People back then would draw code words. These code words, pictures codes, then developed into wedge shaped signs. This type of script was called cuneiform, from the Latin word cuneus, which means wedge. The question is, who used cuneiform? Not everyone learned to read and write. The ones that were picked by the gods were called scribes. Boys that were chosen to become scribes or professional writers began to study at the age of 8. They finished when they were 20 years old. The scribes wrote on clay tablets and used a triangular shaped reed called a stylus to make marks in the clay. The marks represented the tens of thousands of words in their language. You can see some images of cuneiform writing. Religion. What was their religion? Believed the world was a flat disk surrounded by space, above it was the heaven. Polytheistic, and ziggurats were built to connect heaven to earth. They were built of mud bricks and were used for religious holy places. For thousands of years, Nippur was the religious center of Mesopotamia. According to Sumerian religion, it was at Nippur where Enlil, the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon, created mankind. Although never a capital city, Nippur had great political importance because royal rule over Mesopotamia was not considered legitimate without recognition in its temple. Thus, Nippur was the focus of pilgrimage and building programs by dozens of kings, including Hamrabi of Babylon and Ashurbanipal of Assyria. These were their famous leaders, Sargon and Hamrabi. Royal tomb of Ur. Ur was the city, and royal tomb of Ur was very famous. City famed in Bible as the home of patriarch Abraham. Discoveries such as extravagant jewelry of gold, cups of gold and silver, bowls of alabaster, and extraordinary objects of art and culture opened the world's eye to the full glory of ancient Sumerian culture. There was a great death pit, mass grave containing the bodies of 6 guards and 68 servants. In that tomb, 6 guards and 68 servants were buried with their royals. Grave was a great funeral procession. They drank poison, choosing to accompany the kings and queens in the afterlife. Their concept was to live with their kings after life. Epic of Gilgamesh. There were many epic stories in the period of Mesopotamia. Gilgamesh is an ancient story or epic written in Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago. It was first known work of great literature and epic poem. Epic basically mentioned the flood, great flood. Gilgamesh parallel the Nirpur tablet, a six-column tablet telling the certain story of the creation of humans and animals, the cities and their rulers, and the great flood. When we go in the analysis of Gilgamesh and Nippur, we come to know that both parallel stories of Noah and the Ark, Great Flood, in the Old Testament of the Jewish and Christian holy books. But modern science argues that it was the increase of water in the sea level about 6,000 years ago because of the melting ice drained to the oceans causing the sea level to rise more than 10 feet in the 1st century. These are the images of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh epic story. Sports and games. These are the famous games of their time: hunting, boxing, wrestling, polo, rugby, board games, hunting. All civilizations in the world spent their leisure time in sports, games, or other entertainments. Mesopotamia was no exception. Many of the games of ancient world are similar to modern ones. Entertainment was part of their daily life. Games and sports were held in holidays and festival days. Besides hunting, boxing and wrestling were popular means of entertainment. Some form of polo and rugby also amused the Mesopotamia. Ancient Mesopotamia board games. They also used board games. Board games similar to Senet and Backman prevailed. Many forms of toys like toy guns, boomerangs, throw sticks, rattles were used by children. Knowledge about board game is obtained from archaeological excavations because boards were made of clay and stone. The game of 20 squares was similar to the Egyptian game. It involved a race using pieces that moved according to rolls of the dice. It is said that this was the favorite game of palace guards. Hunting was a very popular pastime of the Mesopotamians, especially the kings. Hunting scenes are depicted in the walls of ancient palaces. We know that Assyrian kings enjoyed hunting lions, elephants, and ostriches. Decline of Mesopotamia. What were the reasons of decline of Mesopotamia? There are many reasons, maybe. Historians attribute many reasons for the fall of Mesopotamian empire. Some say that there were overcrowding, which subsequently led to pollution along with other reasons like war and changes in the environment. Mesopotamian cities also had major pollution problems. Lack of indoor toilets and ineffective garbage collection led to contaminated water supplies and frequent epidemics such as typhus. An important observation is that irrigation techniques are also one of the chief reasons for the decline of the empire. When irrigation water is allowed to evaporate in the fields, it leaves behind mineral salts. These mineral salts become highly poisonous for the plants and animals. If irrigation water is drained, erosion occurs. The rivers were higher than the surrounding plain because of built up silt in the river beds. So, water for irrigation flowed into the fields by gravity. Once the water was on the field, it could not readily drain away because the fields were lower than the river. As the water evaporated, it not only left its dissolved minerals salt behind, but also drew salts upward from lower levels of the soil. By 2300 BC, agricultural economy of the Mesopotamian began to shatter as the soil could no longer support plants. Historians also opinion that wars were an important cause for the collapse. In 2000 BC, the last Sumerian dynasty fell, and for almost a century, Mesopotamia was a place of chaos and confusion. In 1900 BC, Amorites captured the region and centralized the government over various city states. Finally, it was the invasion of Hittites, which marked the end of Old Babylonian Empire in Mesopotamia during 1900 BC to 1600 BC. These are the interesting facts of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, specifically Babylon, used a mathematical system based on 60, as all their numbers were expressed as part of or multiplies of 60. Some parts of the base 60 system still remain today, like 360 degree in a circle, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in 1 hour. Devised a calendar. This is another interesting fact of Mesopotamia. They devised a calendar based on cycles of the moon, number of days between the appearance of two new moons was set as a month, 12 cycles made up of a year. Even now we have 12 months in the year. These are the link for further studies. If you want to go to see more images and more studies, you can easily get knowledge from these links. Thank you, students.